This video is an introduction to the types of synovial joints, and there are 6 of them. The first type is the ball and socket. The ball and socket joint permits movement in all planes, including rotation. Well-known examples are the hip and the shoulder. Here is the ball, and there is the socket. Or we have the head of the femur, and that fits into the acetabulum of the pelvic bone. Or we have the head of the humerus, and that fits into the socket on the scapula. Next, we have a hinge joint. A hinge joint only permits movement in one plane. Great example of this is the elbow joint. It's also shown here with a little cartoon illustration. There are other hinge joints as well. For example, the interphalangeal joints. Remember, inter means between, so the joints in between the phalanges. So when you bend your fingers, when you flex your fingers up and down, those are hinge joints. Also, the ankle joint is a hinge joint, and the knee is a modified hinge joint. There's a condyloid or ellipsoidal joint. In the ellipsoidal joint, we have an ovoid condyle fitting into an elliptical cavity. In fact, I think I like this picture better. So here's the ovoid condyle, and that fits into this elliptical cavity. So it kind of looks like a ball and socket joint, but it's not as deep, and it does not permit rotation. It only permits flexion and extension, and abduction and adduction. Examples would include the metacarpophalangeal joint. That's a long word there, but that means nothing more than the joint in between the metacarpals and the phalange. So that's right there. This is an ellipsoidal joint. Same thing is true in the ankle, the tarsal joints, and also the radial carpal joint, which we can see here. Here's the metacarpal phalangeal joint. So right there, those are ellipsoidal joints. This is also an ellipsoidal joint down here. We can see this here as well. Here's the egg shape that fits into the elliptical socket. So it's kind of like a ball and socket, but you just don't have that rotation motion. Next, we have a plane joint or a gliding joint. Here we have the articular surfaces are flat or they're nearly flat, and they can slide and twist. And how much they can slide and twist depends on which joint we're talking about. Great examples of plane joints or gliding joints are the intercarpal joints, or the joints in between carpal bones. Also in between the carpal bones and the metacarpals, those are also plane joints or gliding joints, with the exception of this joint here, which we'll talk about next. And the same thing again is true in the ankles. So here we go. Here's the carpal bones, and then here's the metacarpals out here. And all of these joints here are plane joints. You can see these surfaces are flat or nearly flat, and they glide past one another. And we can also see a plane joint in between the clavicle and the scapula. That's right here. And in between the clavicle and the sternum right there. If we can take another look at that, we see that here's the clavicle, here's the sternum. These are like 2 flat articulating surfaces that are allowed to glide past one another only slightly. And also between vertebrae too, there's a joint here that connects the vertebrae, and that's a plane joint or gliding joint too. And we have the sacroiliac joint, or the joint between the sacrum and the pelvic bone. That's a gliding joint. There's not much gliding permitted here, only small movements. Now, you certainly don't need to know all of these examples. I'm just providing a bunch so you get to see more. There's a saddle joint. This one's kind of a cool joint. It looks like a cowboy in a saddle. And the best known example of that would be here. It's the carpometacarpal joint. So it's where the carpal bone articulates with the metacarpal bone. And this is just on the thumb. Remember, the rest of these carpal metacarpal joints, these are plane joints, but this one here is a saddle joint. And you can see that if you wiggle your thumb around, you get quite a wide variety of movement. There's also the atlanto-occipital joint. And again, you don't need to memorize all these names. But that's a joint in between the occipital bone and the atlas, or the first vertebrae. If we could zoom in on that, what we see is that this is the saddle joint right here. It looks very much like this cartoon does. So this permits a wide variety of movement. And in fact, we're going to look at this joint down here next. The pivot joint. The pivot joint permits only rotation. Classic example is the dens of the axis. And then the atlas rotates around that. So you can see that the dens is like the ring around the dens is completed with this ligament. So what we have is that pivoting around an axis. Other good examples are the proximal radial ulnar joint and the distal radial ulnar joint. Watch this rotation and that pivoting that takes place there. So notice again here how the ulna is largely stationary and there's just rotation or pivoting around that joint.